From the outside, I had it all. A million followers, luxury brand deals, TV appearances, nonstop travel. But here's what no one tells you about making it as a creator. Sometimes the thing that you worked so hard to build becomes the very thing that holds you back. And when that happens, what do? Today, I'm sharing what I learned when I decided to step back. So my story as a creator began back in 2016, and that's when I noticed something. There were a lot of media outlets that covered family travel, but they tended to only focus on budget travel. And then there were a lot of media outlets talking about luxury travel, but none of them talked about what it was like to do luxury travel with kids. And so I thought to myself, there's gotta be more people like us. People who had kids maybe a little bit later in life, and so you'd already grown used to traveling a certain way. You developed a taste for luxury hotels, business class flights, a little bit of the more like bougie side of travel. And just because you had kids didn't mean that you wanted to completely change the way you traveled. And so that's how I came up with the idea for Top Flight Family. Because you really didn't see a lot about luxury family travel, whether it was in traditional media or social media, I really set out to answer these questions that a lot of people had. Like, are Four Seasons hotels actually kid-friendly? Are you allowed to book first class or business class flights for your kids? Of course, the answer is yes and yes. So that was really the goal of Top Flight Family, to kind of show people how, hey, if you enjoy luxury travel, you can still do that even after you have kids. And my goal was really to show families how they could save time, reduce hassle, and maximize comfort on any trip they were doing. So I started Top Flight Family in 2016, and by 2018, I hit my first six-figure year. And that's when I decided to take it full time. So at this time, Serge and I had been running a martial arts school together for a better part of a decade. So I put systems in place to be able to kind of replace myself and step back from that and really focus on Top Flight Family full time. Then 2020 hit, and with the pandemic, we actually decided to close our martial arts school. And even before the pandemic happened, we had already decided that we were going to try homeschooling our girls for a year or two. They had been in public school all that time, to really give this traveling thing a go. So everything kind of lined up at the same time, where for the first time, we were no longer geographically contained to having to be in New York, whether it was for work or for school. It was really the first time that we had the option to be location independent. And so we decided to go all in on travel. I came up with this idea of doing a year-long series called 21 Resorts in 2021, and that ended up being a huge success. When we started that series, we only had a few thousand subscribers on YouTube, but a few months after that series finished, we crossed the 100,000 subscriber mark and earned our silver play button, and everything else was going great. Brand deals were rolling in, so many hotels and resorts and airlines and tourism destinations wanted to work with us. Between Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube, we had over 1 million followers. We were profiled everywhere from Travel and Leisure to The Points Guy to Business Insider. And we made appearances on TV shows like News Nation Now and Good Morning America. So we were living the dream, right? Everything was perfect. This was more than I dreamt was even possible when I started Top Flight Family. After the 21 Resort series, we decided to do another year-long series, which was 22 cities in 2022. And so we launched into our second year of almost full-time travel. But about halfway through that year, something just felt off. Obviously, as people who love travel, being able to travel so frequently was incredible, but it was also absolutely exhausting. I'm sure you've had that experience of going on vacation and then coming home and having those kind of like post-vacation blues, where everything just feels a little duller and a little more disappointing. So we were experiencing that every other week. Our lives became this constant emotional roller coaster of feeling like really excited and really connected, and everything felt amazing when we're on a trip. And then when we came back home, that just felt like a waiting period. That didn't feel like real life. And part of that was for practical reasons, right? Like if you're traveling so much, your body needs some time to rest. So for those first few days back, you're gonna wanna just like chill at home and relax and kind of recuperate. But for me as a content creator, those days when we were home were also the time that I was doing the bulk of the editing. And we were putting out not only a long form YouTube video every single week, each of those takes about 40 hours to edit, but in between we were also publishing Instagram Reels and TikToks. So it was a lot of content that I was constantly churning out. And not to mention I was negotiating brand deals, organizing hotel stays, booking our next trip. All of that was happening in between these trips. And overall, it just created a really unhealthy dynamic for our family, where when we were on a trip, all of us felt really connected with each other and really present and really enjoyed enjoying the moment. And when we got back home, we all sort of retreated into our individual corners of the home. And of course, when you're together 24/7, it's natural to need a little bit of solitude to recuperate. And me being a raging introvert, I needed it more than anyone else. But I think the problem is that it created this very strange phenomenon where it felt like real life was only happening when we were on a trip. And everything in between was just waiting to travel again. And constantly flipping back and forth between this very colorful, bright, exciting travel life and then this really dull, gray, low energy time at home. Constantly going back and forth between those states was really just unhealthy for us, both on an individual level and I think also as a family. And I also feel like there became a little bit of an identity loss. Because our lives were so focused on travel, there was a little bit of this feeling where who are we when we are not traveling? Who are we as individuals or as a family unit when we're not on a trip? What does that look like? And we no longer had a blueprint for that because the time at home was always just this waiting period before we hopped on the next plane. And then there's the process of creating content itself. And this is the thing that most content creators are not going to cop to and will vehemently deny that this is the case. But I'm here to tell you the reality of making content. Now, if you look at our content, whether it's the long form videos on YouTube or short form stuff on TikTok and Reels, you can see that our style is pretty natural, pretty candid. We're not one of those accounts that's doing like corny scripted like skits. We're not giving our children lines to say. Like, you can kind of tell when accounts do that, right? And so for the most part, especially with our YouTube videos, a lot of it was just capturing our travels as it happened. But even for the most sort of naturalistic style content creators, when it comes to any kind of storytelling on video, there is setup involved. If you want to create quality content, it's very rare that you can accomplish that by just literally capturing everything happening in real time candidly. Because very often you're not going to be able to tell the whole story. There will be sort of missing pieces that you need to fill in for the audience because you're not there, or maybe you weren't rolling the camera, or maybe in that moment you weren't really explaining it in the correct detail. And so as a viewer, you can get lost. So there's a lot of times when you have to set up some shots to be able to kind of plug those holes and fill that in so that a video actually makes sense, so that the story makes sense beginning to end. And I would say that when it comes to making short form content, there's probably the most setup involved in that. And that's because it's such a dense format that you have so little time. You only have, each clip is only lasting a second or two. So you have to communicate the most sort of visual content possible within those tiny 2-3 second clips. And so when you make short form content, you really have to put a lot of thought into what those shots look like. And a lot of that takes setting up. So a lot of the content requires someone to set up the camera, set up the tripod, frame it out, make sure that everyone is in frame, no one's falling out of frame. We have to kind of show ourselves in the place. Even simple things, like we would often do these destination reveals. So, we'd be at the airport and it's like, hey, guess where we're going? And then we do a little transition, maybe cover the lens, reveal, and it's like, hey, we're in Rome. Even those little simple videos, you don't always get it on the first take. That's just the reality of making videos because you're doing it in public, right? Sometimes there's going to be someone who walks in front of your camera right when you're trying to shoot, or sometimes your camera falls down because it's windy and the tripod fell over. So it's very rare that you get everything in one take. So there's setup involved, there's repetition. And if you're a solo travel content creator, you're really directing yourself. So it's like you already know what you want and you're just kind of like trying to create the effect. But when you're creating content as any kind of unit, whether it's as a couple, as a family, there is some stage direction involved. And so I found myself not only having to be a mom and a wife, but also somewhat of a director and a producer. And I just really did not enjoy that. And there's no way that that doesn't affect the dynamics of your relationships. So I found myself constantly having to do this emotional labor of sort of tiptoeing around everyone's feelings while at the same time trying to make sure that we actually get the shots that we need because we're only going to be in the spot once ever. There's no redo possible. So it's just really complex and just really heavy at times. And really was all on me. So there was the constant sort of emotional whiplash of traveling and then being home and then traveling and being home. There was all of the sort of emotional labor that goes into having to do a bit of stage directing when you're making content because it is a necessary part of the process and dealing with how that impacts your family dynamics. But the biggest problem was something that I didn't anticipate at all, and that was fame. So if you're watching or listening to this and you're a millennial or you're a Gen Z, you may be thinking to yourself, okay, Carmen, get real. You became an influencer and then you were surprised that you got famous. And here's the thing you have to understand. I'm a Gen Xer, so I was a grown-ass adult already in the workforce for multiple years by the time social media became a thing that existed. So I'm not someone who grew up watching creators on YouTube or on Vine or on Snap. I think to a lot of younger people, they see creators on the same level as they see Hollywood celebrities, right? But for me, I was already an adult when all of these platforms came along. And so I always thought of them more as like user-generated content platforms, which is exactly what social media essentially is. But I guess what I'm trying to say is I never ascribed any sense of like celebrity or importance to people creating content on these platforms. And also because there was such an age gap, and especially in those early years, all that content was really geared towards very young people, right? Like kids. Most of the big creators were basically creating entertainment for children or teens. And so none of that content was really appealing to me as an adult. So I really thought of Instagram and Facebook and blogs as just like a place where people can make content and share ideas. I didn't see those things as a way to jumpstart fame and celebrity. So when we started getting recognized on trips, it was really jarring. And it's complicated because on the one hand, you're happy because it means like, oh, wow, like people are actually watching our content because you see the numbers, right? You see like, okay, this video got this many views, we have this many followers, but it all feels very abstract because it's just numbers on a screen. But then when you actually meet viewers in real life, you realize, oh, wow, like we're actually making an impact on real people's lives. And they tell you, hey, because of this video, we booked this trip and it was amazing, or I was going through a really hard time in my life and watching your video about this trip really gave me so much hope. And it made me decide that, hey, once I get through this difficult period, I'm going to make it my goal to go there as well. And that really got me through this tough time. You start hearing those stories and you're like, oh my God, this is amazing. Our work is actually reaching real people. It's not just these numbers on a screen that I can see on my phone. And we were also lucky enough to only have had positive interactions with our audience members. We've never dealt with any like creepy people, like stalkers, nothing like that. So overall, it was only positive experiences. But even though all of that was really positive, there is still something really jarring about you being used to moving through the world anonymously. And then suddenly that mask of anonymity drops and someone knows who you are. And you kind of realize like, oh, I have to be a little more conscious about how I'm carrying myself, or, maybe people are watching me. And it's a very strange feeling. If you're someone that's always wanted to be famous, like I feel like a lot of people, that's a goal for them, then I'm sure it's amazing. It doesn't feel that complex. But for me, especially being sort of this raging introvert, and one of the reasons I love living in big cities is because I get to move through the world completely anonymously, right? Like I love that. Like to me, that feels like freedom. And so losing that anonymity is just a weird feeling. At the same time that I noticed that we were becoming sort of more and more recognizable, I also experienced a shift in my feelings towards showing kids on social media. I think back in 2016, this wasn't something that was really thought or talked about very much. But I think starting in 2020, and I think for a lot of people, the catalyst was the Micah Stauffer case, which if you're not familiar with it, she was basically a family vlogger who amassed a lot of her audience through adopting a child from China, did really well, got pretty wealthy from, showing the whole adoption process. And her audience was like really involved, was really sort of emotionally involved in this journey that they did and this little boy. And then one day they decided to rehome this child, tried to kind of keep it under wraps, but eventually had to kind of admit to it after everyone was like, hey, what's going on with this kid? And it was one of those cases that I think really shone a spotlight on the extremely problematic elements of family content. And even though we've always been a travel channel, not really a family channel, most of our content is very informational in nature, right? It's like, hey, here's an itinerary, here's a in-depth, review of this hotel. Here's what you can expect if you're booking this business class flight. So our focus is always on the travel, on the destination, on the experience, but we're using our family as a way to kind of like tell that story. Even though our content is not about documenting our everyday lives, I really started having second thoughts about showing my daughters on screen this much. And even though we've only had positive and really lovely interactions with our audience members, the fact that everybody could recognize them and call them by name, hey, Sean, hey, Ella. And very often when we got recognized, it was the girls that got recognized first, and then they noticed me and Serge. And then that started becoming concerning to me as well. And especially because we've been on a lot of group trips, especially, these Disney hosted trips, where we're there with like a lot of really huge creators, like YouTubers with millions of subscribers, and a lot of like really big family vlogging channels. And so we'd be on these trips with these huge YouTubers, these huge family vloggers, and I would see what life was like for these kids. And it's just not the life that I wanted for my children. Because for a lot of these creators, maybe they never meant to amass such a huge audience, but it happened. And because it happened, the parents essentially built this sort of like prison of fame for their children that their children can't escape from. And so their children are walking around Disney World and everyone's like, oh my God, hi, so-and-so. I'm not gonna like name any names, and I don't even know their names. They would be like recognized by name and not even be able to just be a kid and enjoy a day at Disney without having to like cater to fans. And for the parents, that's something they chose, right? They decided to make content and, kind of like do this thing. But for the kids, they were sort of born into it. They didn't have a choice. So when I looked at families like that, I was like, God, I don't want that for my children. That's not the life I want them to lead. So about halfway through the 22 Cities in 2022 series, I already decided that, you know what, this needs to be the final year that we do this. And in the fall of the following year, I want the girls to go back to public school. We're going to sort of end this homeschool, almost full-time travel era and kind of go back to a more regular routine. So fast forward to now, we're in 2025. The girls have been back in school for about a year and a half. Sean is in high school, Ella is in middle school, and their lives are just so much richer than when we were traveling almost full-time. Because obviously travel is amazing, but the reality is that we were also very isolated when we were traveling. Like I would do my best to meet up with other creators and whatever destination we were going to kind of have those moments of connection. But most of the time, it was really just the four of us alone all the time. And the girls also would do their best to kind of make friends when we're at, a hotel or a resort and play in the pool with other kids. And there were those opportunities, but obviously that is not the same as maintaining long-term friendships with people. So the girls' lives right now just look totally different. And it's amazing. I'm so happy because it's exactly what I was hoping for. They have so many friends. They have just their own very rich, multi-layered lives that they're leading that have nothing to do with me, that have nothing to do with content, that have nothing to do with travel. They're just off leading their lives. And I think the most important thing also is that they have complete freedom of movement, because I've spent the last few years sort of stepping back their level of presence in our content to the point where now they show up quite rarely. And also, of course, they look very different now that they're older. And so every day after school, they're just hanging out with their friends. They're exploring the city. They're living their own lives. And they have complete freedom of movement because now they don't have to worry about the fame piece. Like, it's been a long time since we've been recognized in public. And I think most creators would be like, oh my God, we've fallen off. Like, this is terrible. But to me, it's actually like, yes, this is working. This is exactly what I was hoping for. And so, yeah, the girls are able to move around freely. They don't have to worry about, being followed by weirdos who are obsessed with them. I mean, they have to worry about just the normal New York City weirdos, but, not like social media weirdos. So as a mom, I just feel like that was not an easy decision to make because it meant walking away from a pretty lucrative business and that had a lot more upside potential if we had just continued these year-long series, 23 islands in 2023. That was sort of the logical next step. 24 countries in 2024. We could have kept it going for years, but at what cost? In making this decision, I definitely gave up a lot. But ultimately, when I look at my girls and I look at the rich lives they're leading right now, I know in my heart of hearts that I made exactly the right decision. So the last couple of years has really been a process of me trying to figure out, well, what does my content look like if family travel is not the be all and end all of what I do? And some stuff has worked, some stuff hasn't, but that's the nature of evolution and pivoting. But to me, this process has really made me think about other eras of my career. And there's actually been multiple times in my career where I was at a point where my work had a ton of prestige and a lot of people were looking at me like, oh my God, I can't believe this thing you built and you're so lucky. And I decided to walk away from it. And I'll be sharing some more of those stories in future videos. It made me realize that a lot of us really get trapped by prestige. We build something and it makes us feel really important. It makes people admire us and other people are envious because they want the same thing. And even when we know it's no longer aligned with our values, we don't want to let go of it because we wonder what other people are going to think. And what I've realized through this process is that you really have to pay attention to your voice within. And when something feels like it's misaligned, you're going to reach a breaking point, whether you decide to make the change or whether it decides to make the change for you. And at the end of the day, social media success shouldn't come at the cost of your family's privacy or your own creative freedom. The goal shouldn't be just to chase numbers forever. It should be to build something that feels aligned to your values. So when you let go of what looks impressive to create space for something that actually feels right, that's when real success begins. So whether you're building a platform or building a life, remember to always pack light and live full.